that means that you could accurately and reliably predict ahead of time. You could predict ahead of time how well someone's going to respond to a program, which you can't do, how quickly they're going to respond, right? So do they gain 10% in strength in 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 1 week? Okay. And further, what their day-to-day performance is going to be on average. The idea that stays static, I mean, that's not based in any sort of research. We know that people will go up and down like a sinusoidal wave, right? They'll have days, oh man, I'm feeling it. Days, I'm not feeling it. And it's like, so you have 3 variables going on at once. So how the hell are you going to predict stuff in advance? The only thing I can predict is unpredictability. And so having tools baked into the program that allows somebody to match that training stimulus allows me to feel confident that the progression is going to be there, or at least well suited to where they're currently at.
Greetings, Leg Tuck Nation. Welcome back. If it's your first time, welcome home. This week we've got an incredible episode lined up for you. We're talking to somebody who is just an absolute legend in the space. Alex, who do we have on this week?
We have the Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. If you don't recognize the name immediately, but it sounds familiar, you've probably been exposed to his content through Barbell Medicine, his company. And as the name Barbell Medicine implies, Dr. Feigenbaum is both a strength coach and a medical doctor. In addition to a bunch of classic credentials, CSCS, ACSM, health and fitness specialist, USA weightlifting, CrossFit Level 1. He spent a long time with starting strength seminar staff. And then, of course, got his MD from Eastern Virginia Medical School. On top of that, he kind of walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. He's an elite powerlifter who can claim one of the top 20 totals of all time. His best performance, he was 198 pounds and he squatted 640 pounds, benched 430 pounds, and deadlifted 725 pounds. Outside of coaching, he's an avid reader and traveler, and you'll pick up during the episode a little bit. He's got a really impressive ability to just kind of cite details of research off the cuff that are extremely relevant to the conversation in a way I wish I could.
This was one of those episodes that, for me as a strength coach, was a little bit surreal, and kind of one of the things that makes me glad that we decided to do this podcast in the first place, because you get the chance to talk to guys like this. Jordan and Barbell Medicine have been hugely influential with regards to how I program for myself, for the athletes that I work with. And he's also one of those guys like Alec from a few episodes back that's super worth the follow on Instagram, just because of the number of Q&As he posts, the number of research articles he talks about, the content. So enjoy the conversation. Enjoy Jordan. And I'm out of things to enjoy at this point.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a special shout out to this one because the whole conversation happened entirely because of a debate in Instagram stories. So starting fights produced something very productive here.
That is true. Alex started a fight, an intellectual battle. Jordan was tagged. No, it was based off of a video Jordan posted. Uh-huh. And then we got him on the podcast. So for all of you out there that disagree with what we say, please reach out, please engage, because that tends to lead to really cool guests. So enjoy. We're not great podcasters, but we're worse actors for sure.
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, that's cool though. You guys are getting some traffic, so it's well deserved.
Well, let me ask you this, because we can go in a million different directions here. I mean, you guys have a massive platform, but to tee things off, I'm curious, because I've been a fan for a long time. Medical background, you've got powerlifting background, coaching background, all of the above. When you are asked what a coach is, I'm curious. Yeah, right. The easiest question ever. I'm just curious. And I think mostly from like dealing with patients in that space, because that's a lot of kind of the population we work with. Not that they're sick, ill, and injured, but it's a different population than like an elite sport population. So I'm curious, when you think about a coach, what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, so in all of these arenas, you're coaching, right? It's just some of it's behavioral change coaching. Other stuff is, more granular adjustments of like actual, the nuts and bolts of a program to elicit top end performance, or, in your guys' case, top end testing when they have to go through the ACFT or whatever, or injury risk reduction, all things. So in medicine, it's coaching, but it's behavioral change type coaching for the most part, engaging in enough physical activity to reduce risk of disease, or eating a health promoting dietary pattern, or even just taking medications, right? Being adherent to a medication, a medical intervention, something like that. But then when it comes to like sports medicine, a lot of this stuff isn't, people are already doing that. And so you're kind of cranking it up to the next level. Like, okay, cool. Well, you're exercising, but let's tweak these parameters. And then you get even further down the line into actual competitive athletes, and you're just ratcheting it up. And so it's coaching, the whole way through, just different, I don't know, different types and different levels of complexity and stuff like that. So what is a coach? Someone who is making recommendations to elicit a change. I mean, really at a base level. And so just what level of change, and what are your, what levers do you have access to pull? So for a strength conditioning coach, that you got to let some levers, right? You can adjust the program, you can adjust nutrition, you can adjust supplementation, you can adjust all sorts of stuff like that, some elements of lifestyle. And then if you're a physician, you have more levers to pull on some level, and then less levers because how do you discuss exercise, right? If the average primary care visit is, a handful of minutes, you're like, well, we can screen you for the stuff that, age appropriate screenings, stuff related to your medical history, your family medical history, et cetera. And then, oh, by the way, we should talk about exercise, but we'll do that at your next visit. Or, I mean, that's how it would work in a normal clinic when you're seeing 30, patients a day and you're on a clock. So yeah, but making recommendations and working with the individual based on their preferences and resources and stuff like that to elicit a change. It feels like coaching all the way through.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because it was something I was wondering about. I have friends from college who are MDs now. One of my old roommates is an MD now, and it seems like what they were like told in medical school was that you're not going to have the time to really dig into behavioral change stuff with your patients. Like they rationally acknowledge the importance of lifestyle and health, but they kind of ignore it from a clinical standpoint because they just don't have the time or bandwidth because of the number of patients they have to see in the day. And I'm curious about, like, do you think doctors have more levers to pull in terms of lifestyle stuff, or do you honestly think coaches might have more levers to pull in terms of contact time with the people to elicit changes?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have more face time, a coach does, or like a trainer, or, whatever. And to be clear, I do not make this arbitrary distinction between trainers and coaches. I feel like again, it's like the difference between, yeah, well, it's different. It's like the difference between training and exercise, right? Just made up arbitrary criteria that's self-serving to the person making the distinction. And I'm like, I don't care, guys. So I don't even call it training anymore. I call it exercise training, just to annoy both.
How dare you?
Right. But to your point about time spent. So the best data we have on this shows that the number needed to treat, so the amount of patients you need to see who are previously insufficiently active, so not meeting the physical activity guidelines, to get one person to sustain chronic adherence, so over a year, at meeting or exceeding the physical activity guidelines, is 12. And that requires something like less than a minute of actual like interface with them. So effectively you say, we should exercise. Here's what we should do. Here are some resources, send them on the way. Is that the optimal type of behavioral change? Well, of course not. You would want to, say, hey, what do you have access to? What can we do? What do you want to do, et cetera? And kind of like sketch out a plan that the person is an active manager in, choosing their own adventure, and follow up with them on short notice. So that way you're just making sure that they're starting off on the right track. And then maybe that number drops right from 12 to 8 or 7 or 6 or whatever. Or worst case scenario, you refer them to an exercise professional, right? That's like somewhere nearby and that they can afford or is otherwise subsidized. It'd be great if it was in the clinic. Oh yeah, just walk down the hall, see Drew. He's right there. That would be ideal. That way you get less sort of churn or you miss less people. But with the number needed to treat of 12, with that short level of interface, I feel like, doctors, mainly because of their the hierarchy and the kind of like the trust that's already there, you're making up for the lack of time with sort of this trust that's already there. I don't know. And if the doctor says, yeah, you should exercise, you're like, yeah, maybe I probably should. But yeah, it would be better. It'd be better if you had more time. And unfortunately, in many settings, the best you can do is refer. And so the bigger problem in my view is that doctors are not doing the referrals, like, or they can't do the referrals, right? You can't refer to a dietitian until somebody has diabetes, not if they have pre-diabetes or like on that pathway. Or you can't refer to an exercise professional because you don't know anything, like you're not aware, or you don't feel comfortable discussing these things. I mean, there are a whole bunch of barriers that have been identified in the literature as to why primary care physicians are not actively engaging in this stuff. So right now, the most recent data we've seen on this is that less than 10% of primary care physicians even know that the current physical activity guidelines exist. And of the 10% that know that they exist, less than half of them are referring their patients to do it, like recommending it. So just, so how do you fix that? Is it an education thing? Because, I went through medical school relatively recently and we didn't learn anything about the physical activity guidelines. Just, to your point, it's more like lip service is paid to lifestyle interventions. Like, oh yeah, of course you should eat a health promoting diet. And of course you should exercise. It's like, cool. So what does that look like? Right. And then further, how do we, in our limited time that we get to interface with the patients, how do we even recommend that, bring it up, or refer? Like how literally primary or lifestyle interventions, what do, like how? So yeah, is it an education thing? So we probably should shore that up. Honestly, if it's like a checkbox on the EMR, like, did you counsel your patient on exercise? Like, check the box, make sure you did it. Same thing on dietary patterns. And, of course you can't do it at every visit. If it's a medication refill, if it's, a emergency visit for something else unrelated to lifestyle, yeah, you probably can't do it at every visit. But if we took that 10% that even know what the exercise guidelines are, and we raise that to 30%, and that we know the number needed to treat is 12. I mean, how many more people do we get engaging in exercise? That'll be huge. And so that's the bottom of the pyramid, right? As you go up to like sports medicine or ortho, or, you get in some of these niche populations, it's like, does their knowledge of exercise get better? And I don't think that's the case. That hasn't been my experience, interfacing with sports medicine professionals or orthopedic, surgeons. And that's not a knock against them. How would they know? Unless they have a personal interest in this sort of stuff. In which case it's like, so you had to seek out additional knowledge. Where did you go? How good is that knowledge? Like all sorts of stuff. So yeah, big issue for sure.
Well, it makes me think of, because we've talked about this before, and I don't know if I'm probably biased because my entire career has been in tactical human performance, but I feel like in this space more so than maybe even the collegiate or professional space, as a coach, you're confronted with the medical model a lot more frequently than you would be if you're just kind of in the sports world. And so we've kind of pushed this out on coaches, or really anybody who's involved in these teams, of like, you do have to have an understanding of what is going on the medical side of the house, and then vice versa, the folks on the medical side of the house. It helps to be able to kind of walk the walk with the folks that spend the most amount of time interfacing with the soldiers, which in our case would be the strength coaches. And so I guess the question there for you, because you're very experienced on both sides of these things, is like, do you see a world where it's less of a siloed kind of access to care and more of a spectrum, if that makes sense, where, like, not saying there's strength coaches in hospitals or doctors in gym or whatever, but it's just understood that, like, hey, the intervention across the board is whatever is appropriate for the patient / athlete / whatever.
Yeah. I in my utopia, yeah. So ultimately what you'd want physicians who are they themselves are meeting the physical activity guidelines, right? Engaged in some sort of regular physical activity that they find enjoyable or whatever. And, that's going to include some element of resistance training and some elements of aerobic conditioning. And so they have this like personal experience with it. And that allows them to kind of, interact with the patient and share these sort of experiences and have some level of knowledge there. And they probably feel more comfortable also, sort of recommending it from that standpoint. And then you'd also want the strength coaches and the trainers and the fitness professionals to have a knowledge, some base level knowledge of like, look, the majority of your clients are going to have at least one medical condition, and here's how that interacts with their training. And so that's what we're trying to do, right? Is to bridge that gap. And it's like, we don't want these two entities to be separate. They need to be related. And, from a medical perspective, it's like, yeah, obviously there are clear benefits to these lifestyle changes. So how do we get that to be recommended and, and pushed harder? And then from the fitness and performance side, it's like, yeah, you're going to interface with people who have high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, who are coming back from surgery or injuries and all these other sorts of things. And it's like, great. So what are the real restrictions, if any, and what sort of training related modifications need to be in place so that they get great results, so you don't hurt anybody and this, that, and the other. And I think what's happened, unfortunately, is that you have these like very risk averse recommendations that are just made up out of nowhere. And so it's like, if for example, one of the best examples is post hernia operation, right? So hernias are super, super common. Inguinal hernias are the most common. And the recommendation after hernia repair surgery in general from surgeons is not to lift anything, greater than 5 pounds for whatever. They make it up 3 months, 6 months. Yeah, ever. But the international hernia guidelines say there should be no restrictions in exercise post-operatively. No restrictions. They make a point that all of these recommendations are just made up, not based on evidence. And the existing evidence that we do have suggests no increase in complications from people who do engage in exercise in close proximity to their to the operations. Same thing after like radical mastectomy, lymph node dissection, stuff like that. And these are like not supervised exercise sessions. They basically send people home with weights and say, yo, lift the shit out of these things. And they're like, okay. And there are no difference in complications. And so, I mean, you can't hang your hat on that for every surgical procedure, obviously, but you would want to get to a world where, again, physicians are more comfortable talking about this stuff, actively recommending it, not gatekeeping people like engaging in exercise due to this sort of risk averse, litigious society that we're in now, particularly on the medical side. And then you'd also want trainers to be comfortable working with the complicated client, the client who has multiple medical comorbidities, and not, well, you've got all these things, so we're going to underdose and training, and you're not going to get any better, or the people are actually going to get worse and detrain for a long period of time, and then what? In the case of the soldier, imagine them coming back from surgery and then they haven't done any exercise for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, you have your ACFT coming up. So now what?
It's all the time.
Yeah, but then they have to start training for that, right? And they're like, oh, I got 3 weeks to do this, and they overdo it. They get injured again. It's like, well, now what? Yep. So yeah, you'd want to bridge the gap there, and I think that's really what we're trying to do. I thought when they started this company rather 10 years ago, I was like, man, why is no one doing this? And I thought in the interim, there's going to be people cropping up and doing this thing, we're still the only people doing it. And so like, does that mean that the market just isn't there, or that the fund of knowledge across both of these categories is so specialized that maybe you can only have a handful of people that kind of do bridge this gap, in which case, fine, I'm happy to do it. But I would hope that this gets a little bit more traction.
I'm curious, and you sort of just touched on this, but like, what are the hurdles? Because to me, it's one of those things where it's like everyone will objectively acknowledge that healthy lifestyle behaviors, exercise, yada, 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 are good for you. But yet we still see this world. And again, I'll look at the medical model where like you prescribe medication, we know the answer when we're just not doing it. And I think you guys are primed to do it because it literally is barbell medicine. So what are the hurdles you guys have seen in kind of making this mainstream type stuff?
I mean, if you look at the barriers to engaging in physical activity, most of them are not related to knowledge, right? So it's not like you need to tell people that exercise is beneficial, because people are like, yeah, we got it. We got it. The main thing is making it more accessible. So whether that's having more places to be physically active, reduced cost, certain types of facilities that are accessible to folks who either would be like adaptive type athletes or other, things of that nature. So across the spectrum, they're effectively more logistical type barriers than education. So it's either time, access, things of that nature that ultimately like reflect behaviors. And so like if you don't have access to a place that you can exercise, feel safe exercising or whatever, like you're not going to do it. If you don't feel like you have time, for example, if you have to work 2 or 3 jobs and then you've got kids at home and this, that, and the other, it's like, well, all right, well, there's not protected time to engage in physical activity. And so fixing those things, I mean, that's a societal level deal, right?
Right.
But the interesting thing that relates to your podcast audience in particular is that in the military, you do have protected time, at least theoretically, to like do this stuff. You know, you got your PT, it's like bare minimum, and then you have like additional time where you could go to the gym and there are facilities that you have access to or whatever. And it's like, I do wonder, and I have not been able to find any good data on this, what amount of, you know, military personnel actually meet or exceed the physical activity guidelines.
Probably way fewer than you think.
Well, yeah. So like at a population level, if you ask people, about half of them will report that they're meeting the aerobic guidelines. So if you just ask them and you say, look, here's what the guidelines say for the aerobic training component, which is about 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week. So 20 to 30 minutes a day, something like that. People are like, about half people will be like, yeah, I did it. And if you strap an accelerometer to them, anywhere between 5 to 10% actually are doing it, but self-reported about half. And then if you add on to that the resistance training component, which is at least twice per week of resistance training, that number drops to about a quarter, again, of self-reported like adherence. And so if you combine all of that together, the amount of people in the Gen Pop that are meeting the guidelines is probably about 2.5%, 3%. And that's probably overestimates how many people are doing it. And so you would expect the military to be higher than that, but I don't know how much higher. Is it 20%? Is it 30%?
I think it's interesting because I think part of it all comes back to behavior change kind of stuff, obviously. But a big component of it is that our dosing is pretty wild. We have to follow a very one size fits all kind of model. And what that ends up doing is you find some people where like whatever we're dosing them with is not enough for them. And they're like hyped on fitness, and you find them in the gym before PT and after work and all that kind of stuff. And then there's a whole nother population that is the population we should probably be concerned with, who kind of get their ass kicked at PT and learn that exercise is a miserable experience where somebody's yelling at them and they have to be up early and it's dark and it's cold and it sucks. And that does not create a world where they're probably going to go seek out extra exercise on their own, short of somebody like forcing them to, which just makes the whole thing even worse. And you're touching on social determinants of health kind of stuff. And I don't think we spend enough time necessarily talking about it. I'll trigger Drew real bad by talking about like the nutrition environment on military installations.
Oh my God.
But we focus on the PT thing and we protect that time, and we absolutely do, but we don't really set conditions for like health and wellness beyond that terribly well.
Sure.
I think I don't know. This is mostly a rant that I was hoping would end in a question that's not really ending in a question, but I don't know how we have conversations better about like organizations' responsibility to create those social conditions for healthy lifestyles.
Yeah. I mean, from an access standpoint and from like, you know, for physical activity, I feel like the military is probably doing the most there, you know. But as far as the environment, I could imagine there's just like everything else and related to social determinants of health, there's going to be a wide array of people and feelings about, oh yeah, I like this setup, and so I'm apt to participate, and other people will be like, that's very intimidating, I'm not going to do it. And further, like, we know one of the biggest predictors of adherence to physical activity is your self-reported enjoyment of what you're doing. And it's like, okay, well, we know the constraints, we know what you have to be able to do to be fit for duty, at least as far as the tests are concerned.
Yeah, as far as the test is concerned.
Yeah. And so, but like, there are many different roads to Rome there, right? So there are many different ways you can get to that level of service or of fitness. And so you would prefer that each individual, you know, based on their needs and their preferences and everything, kind of has their own individualized plan and support structure and everything else to get them to do it. And that's just from the physical activity side. And you would want that to dovetail nicely into the food environment so that you know, gets them to engage in a health promoting dietary pattern so that they can make weight or measurements or whatever, and ultimately have a really fit, robust, you know, military personnel. But I don't know. I've only spent a limited amount of time on base. Like, I did a lot of my medical rotations at Navy Portsmouth Hospital. So that's like one place that I spent some time at. And then we were at, what was it? It's in the Sierra Nevada desert. It's in California.
Irwin?
Yeah. We were
Oh
Fort
God.
Irwin. Yeah, well, so
I'm sorry.
well, we came down. This is right when the ACFT came out, and they were like really wanting us to talk about low back pain and deadlifts and
Oh
stuff like
yeah,
that.
deadlift.
Yeah. And so we went down there. I was like, what the heck goes on out here? And they were like, basically, it's war games, right? It's like before you go off to, yeah. And
I've done a little bit of time before there, when a couple trips out there.
Wild.
It's a whole
War is hell.
thing.
Yeah. I mean, their gym looked great though. I was like,
Mhm.
I mean, I would spend some time here, but yeah, I was like, can we get like on the range or something? And they're like, we have a goat problem. I'm like, a what problem? Like, yeah, we had a goat problem. There's too many
There's
goats.
donkeys too. And there's like desert tortoises, and there's a whole. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I thought about, I was like, what about a tank? Can we get into a tank? And the guy was like, you absolutely do not want to get into a tank. It's going to be the most uncomfortable experience of your entire life. And I was like,
Well, it's probably like 110
right.
degrees outside.
I don't know, man.
Yeah.
That'd be a cool box to check.
I think so. But then, talking to other people who've actually been in tanks, they're like, yeah, it's super small, it's super rough. There's no suspension. And if
Yeah,
they happen to fire around while you're in there, and I was
Sure,
like, maybe
that's,
it's better.
that's all true, but like it's still a tank.
It's still a
pretty sweet.
tank, though. You're still
Yeah, that would have been cool to say. Like two truths and a lie. Like, I've been in a tank, we fired around. Yeah, I don't know. That would have been cool. But I don't know. I haven't spent enough time to really know about all the different food environments. But I will tell you, when we're going to the cafeteria, I was like, how do we eat like a health promoting dietary
Oh my
pattern
God,
here?
don't get me started.
And this is me, like, kind of, I'm like, all right, well, I can afford the extra, whatever cost it is to eat something. But I was like, nothing's really available here. And it seems like I would just live off like energy drinks and, and maybe some
You would
protein
do
shakes
so
and-
well in the military.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just drink all the energy drinks, stay up all night, you'll be fine. Yeah, what's the worst that could happen?
Well, so you touched on something there that is going to lead to a question of mine, and I say this as somebody who has followed barbell medicine for a long time. One of the reasons,
Oh boy.
well, one of the reasons why is because you guys put a really big emphasis on individualization, autoregulation, athlete-centric programming, et cetera. And I would argue that outside of like one-on-one coaching, there is I don't want to use the word industrialized aspect like negatively, but you guys have found the ability to provide a product to really anyone online that tailors to the sort of the individual needs of the athlete. And one of the things that we've kind of gone on and on and on about with H2F specifically, but really with embedded human performance at large in the military, is the reason for it at like a general officer level is to quote unquote like individualize training for the soldier, sailor, whatever. When realistically, the coaches that we work with, it's like one coach for 500, 1,000, 1,500 soldiers. And so we haven't really gotten away from industrialized human performance. And I guess the question I have for you is, when you talk about strategies that you guys take to individualize training, to auto-regulate training, aside from just the nitty-gritty reps and sets and that sort of stuff, what are some of the things that you hang your hat on? Is it education of the athlete? Is it the way that you structure the training? Is it a combination of all of the above to create an environment that caters to one-on-one aspect while still allowing the masses?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I feel like we try to come at it from all sides. From the actual individual standpoint, you don't need to explain everything. They don't need to become a strength coach to strength train, for example, and they don't need to become a fitness professional just to improve their fitness. But at the same time, they kind of need to know why they're doing what they're doing. That way there's less sort of like meandering the path. They're kind of like, okay, I feel empowered to self-select, for example, different exercises. So in that context, we're like, all right, we know that you need to, or we think that you need to do some sort of squat pattern. You need to do some sort of push pattern, right? You need to do some sort of pull pattern and a hinge pattern, right? And we're working all the major muscle groups of the body multiple times per week in a wide variety of different rep ranges, intensity ranges, et cetera. So we can build this big, robust base of physical fitness. But as far as which exercises you choose and which specific rep scheme you choose, that stuff is more personal preference, right? So if a person really wants to squat with a bar on their back, we're like, great, we're barbell medicine. We're your folks. Like, welcome to the club. But if a person's like, I'd rather do leg press, we're like, hey, great. Like, you're still doing that's a type of squat pattern. That's great. You can live a full and complete life without ever squatting with the bar on your back. You're just going to be limited in some places if they don't have a leg press, for example. And in that case, you're going to have a plan B. But them knowing, like, I just need to do some sort of squat pattern, and here's like a list or like or here are some components of those exercises that I need to know, so I could pick one that I want to do and will do. That kind of empowers them to like be the manager of their own program. And so you do that for all the major movement patterns. And we just construct these full body workouts where the person gets to choose, what exercise do I actually want to do? And then we also bake in some auto regulation components. So, all right, we want you to do some maximal strength work. That's going to be in that sort of 3 to 6 rep range. And you're going to leave about 2 to 3 reps left in the tank. We're going to do some, higher rep work, and that's going to be in that sort of 12 to 15 rep range, and then stuff in the middle. And we're going to kind of give you the option to pick which exercises and match with particular rep schemes and particular proximities to failure. And you get to kind of choose based on your preferences and just go to town. And so that just empowers people to take ownership of what they're doing. And you can write a program that has these options kind of baked into it. And that's what a lot of our spreadsheets, our templates rather, look like. And so that's how we kind of auto-regulate and scale that and distribute it to the masses, rather than having like one-on-one interactions with all these folks, which we would like. That allows, there's some benefits to that, right? You get to ask people what are the obstacles that they're facing. You can kind of troubleshoot on the spot or whatever. But if you're talking about thousands of folks, you just don't have the manpower. Or in the case of the military, operation, you got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so how do you distribute that? So from a program perspective, we do that. From a coach education perspective, yeah, it's more so in that case about expanding their fund of knowledge so that they understand the great flexibility that they actually have here. Because everybody comes from their own different background, their unique experiences. And so they might think, well, look, the only way to get strong is to do heavy sets of 5. And you're like, that is a way to get strong. That is true. But there are many different ways in strategies you can use. And so giving them more tools in the toolbox allows them to kind of suit the other people that they interact with pretty regularly. So we try to do it from both ends, but ultimately you want people to be able to choose their own adventure, to auto-regulate, and then to also sort of find something that they enjoy and then ultimately can thrive in. And I think you can do that by increasing options, and a little bit will go a long way. You don't have to give people a list of, here are 15 potential exercises you can do. It could just be 3 or 4. And at least then they're kind of selecting, rather than saying you have to trap bar deadlift, you have to, bench press, or you have to, do this other thing. And it's like, do you though? Like you might for the test, you might want some direct exposure there, but there are many different ways that you can kind of achieve this, what I would call a base level of fitness needed to be fit and ready for duty. So hopefully, I think that answered your question.
No, it did, because I'm like, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, because we've talked about this with a number of different guests and with a number of different coaches. This, like, I don't know how to keep it succinct, but basically this maybe fear that coaches have of surrendering some of the control to the athlete when it comes to managing training. And then simultaneously, this positive feedback loop that exists for, I would say, most coaches, where they grew up in a system and the system worked for the folks that worked in that system, and they didn't account for anybody who failed to work in that system. Ipso facto, this system's the best. Who cares about the 10,000 people that it didn't work for?
Right. You get like a survivorship bias almost, like you only interface with people who like thrived. What about the people who fell off?
Right.
And so, I mean, we get people all the time. They're like, I ran your power building program and I got weaker. And we're like, well, we do expect, some people to be quote unquote non-responders to, any of our given programs. And what you need to know about that is that doesn't mean you're a non-responder to all programs, just that the dose that we were giving you and the formulation of the program were not well suited to your current levels of fitness, your current needs, and or your current preferences. And so how, having a sort of little fund of knowledge about what can we manipulate, what can we tweak, and having that baked into the recommendation allows people to kind of identify, what really does work for them. It's kind of like sports, right? It's like you can try a particular sport and be terrible at it. Terrible, but that doesn't mean you're going to be terrible at all sports. And so what you see in the greatest sporting nations in the world is that they have a high level of sampling at a relatively young age, and you kind of identify like, oh, I actually thrive in field hockey or lacrosse and not football, right? If they have opportunities to try these sports on for size. And so we kind of want to do that with exercise programming. Like, look, if you try a program and retrospectively you look back, it didn't really work that well. That doesn't mean that you're just, not working hard enough. You're a moral failure. You're like terrible person, whatever. It's just that, well, that particular program didn't fit your, what you need. And so let's tweak things based on, again, this little bit of knowledge and these like fundamental principles. But yeah, not being married to any particular style is probably the knowledge I would impart on a strength coach.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, I mean, my preference would be like, yeah, you're going to squat, you're going to bench, you're going to deadlift. I like powerlifting. You should like powerlifting. But if somebody doesn't, they can get stronger doing other stuff, and that's fine too. Yeah, I don't know. I forget, Drew, what were we arguing about with that person on the internet? Do you remember? Was it like a progression thing or something?
Oh man. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's do it. I forgot. It just came to my mind.
I'll pull up the archive here. We end up in fights a lot. The thing at the root of most of the fights we get into tends to be periodization and how you define the word periodization and how important you think it is compared to other training variables.
Well, we do this intentionally, right? Because like what I'm getting at, and maybe what I'm trying to chip away, and I realize it's an uphill battle and there's this paradigm of strength and conditioning, cool. But the argument to be made is that because tactical human performance is relatively new, we have a blank canvas within which we can create a new paradigm. And that's kind of what we're setting out to do. And part of that is dismantling this idea that as a coach, I have to retreat to my secret lair and plan out 12 weeks up to 4 years of a training cycle. And if you can't do, 3x5 at 85%, 16 Thursdays from now, you're a bad athlete. I'm still a good coach. Who's next in line? Like, that's what I'm trying to get away from. And so Alex, bless his heart, running the Instagram and just annihilating people about periodization tends to trigger a lot of coaches, because we have found that level of planning creates a security blanket. And if you take that away and you force folks to think critically and adapt to the athlete, and heaven forbid we use enjoyment as like a programming variable or compliance or whatever, we just, I think as an industry, aren't primed to know what to do with that. And so that's, I think, one of the things that led to what we were fighting about on Instagram the other day.
Yeah. Well, the guy deleted his comment or like his story where he was like, I don't really agree. Because I was talking about progression, right? So progression, strictly speaking, is just going to be how you match a given exercise session's variables to the individual's current level of fitness and performance. So that could be weight, could be reps, could be rest periods. Really depends on which adaptations you're trying to select for. So do you always add weight? Do you always go up in load? Do you always add reps, or are you trying to? Do you always decrease rest periods, etc.? So that is progression. Periodization, the way that I view it, and the way that kind of, I think it's Stone and Bompa and some of these other previous figureheads in the space, they're just talking about the manipulation of training variables over time as a exercise and stress management. And so does that mean that over the course of a training program, the average intensity goes up, right? And volume goes down? Just your standard linear periodization? Is it undulating? Is it, whatever? You can make it whatever you want, but it's not the same thing as progression. So our thing is that if you're trying to always, and we think you should always be trying to match the training stimulus to the individual's current level of fitness and performance, that's determining your progression. And so some weeks you may be adding weight if your performance went up, if your fitness level went up, and you're just keeping it matched, right? It's like the Greg LeMond quote, like it never gets easier, you just go faster. And so it should be like the same level of hardness. If you add weight to the bar and it becomes harder, I don't know that you got any stronger. And I don't know that progression makes any sense. It just means that it's harder. You cause more fatigue. I don't know that you're causing more of an adaptation. It's just harder. That's the only thing I can actually say. For me, that doesn't really fit in with periodization, because I'm not necessarily trying to make it harder. I'm just trying to make it work in a way to develop particular adaptations. And so if I'm talking about maximal low velocity strength, I know that the reps are going to go down over the course of a entire training program. I know that the average weight is going to go up, but I don't know that it's going to get harder and harder and harder. It's just going to be a different type of hard. So at the beginning, it might be more volume, higher proximity to failure. You're RP7, RP6, RP8 for most of your sets. And as you get closer and closer to the end, maybe it's RP9, RP10 on here and there, just to try to like maximize or identify what your max level of performance is if it's a testing week. But that's a periodization model versus a progression sort of scheme. And so I really think where we've kind of lost the plot is when we talk about progressive overload, people hear the word overload and they're like, it has to be harder. And it's like, it doesn't really have to be harder. It has to be hard enough. And you have to like maintain that level of hardness throughout. If you go into the gym and you underload, you're not going to get the best results. Just like if you go into the gym and you overload, you're not going to get the best results. And so that matching, like how do you do that matching? And that's based on this kind of progressive loading model, which you can use real-time feedback in an exercise, in a workout. So what's the velocity of the barbell, for example, if you have a tool to measure that, how hard does it feel during your warm-up sets? And your sort of experience is a better predictor of that than whatever the hell it says on the paper. They just like, 85%. I'm going to load 85%. Like 85% of what? Because if the 1RM is no longer valid, then what the hell does 85% mean? You know what I'm saying? So like, I use myself as an example. My best squat that I've ever squatted is 290 kilos, 641 pounds or whatever it is. I cannot squat that today. I'm hoping that in 10 weeks at a meet, I can squat that or maybe a little bit more. But if I was doing only percentage work based off 640, I mean, all of my training would be, mismatched. And so I would not be getting the best results because it is not matched to what I can currently squat today, which is probably closer to 606 or 616. And that changes day to day. That changes as my adaptations wax and wane or ebb and flow. And that changes based on my response to the program. If my response to the program's through the roof, my adaptation rate's through the roof, and my performance on a given day is also through the roof, oh boy, I better load that thing heavy to take advantage. On the other hand, if my performance is down, if I'm not responding well to the program for that particular day or in that particular time space, then I need to temper the load. And that's the progression, right? Which is different than the periodization. The periodization I view as like the master plan, and the progression is like, how do you account for that day to day? And the guy, I can't remember what he said because he deleted the damn thing, but he was like, I don't know that I agree, blah, blah, blah. You should be able to plan stuff out months in advance, something to that. And I'm like, what? Like that means that you could accurately and reliably predict ahead of time. You could predict ahead of time how well someone's going to respond to a program, which you can't do, how quickly they're going to respond, right? So do they gain 10% in strength in 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 1 week? Okay. And further, what their day-to-day performance is going to be on average. The idea that stays static, I mean, that's not based in any sort of research. We know that people will go up and down like a sinusoidal wave, right? They'll have days, oh man, I'm feeling it. Days, I'm not feeling it. And it's like, so you have 3 variables going on at once. So how the hell are you going to predict stuff in advance? The only thing I can predict is unpredictability. And so having tools baked into the program that allows somebody to match that training stimulus allows me to feel confident that the progression is going to be there, or at least well suited to where they're currently at. And that should fit in my periodization model overall, whether I'm using linear periodization, undulating periodization, block conjugate periodization, whatever.
Conjugate undulating.
So, okay, this is an aside, but this is funny to me.
Please.
So people will talk about conjugate training versus conjugate periodization, right? So conjugate periodization is really just block training, which is cool. So you focus on like one thing for a particular block. It's hypertrophy, it's strength, it's conditioning, it's whatever. And then you move on to the next one. So after hypertrophy, you move to strength. After strength, you move to power. And the idea is that the elements of the training program are really, really trying to hammer those, the selected adaptations without really decaying any of the ones you built in the previous blocks.
That's residuals.
Correct. Yeah. So that's like the nuts and bolts of conjugate periodization. Conjugate training, on the other hand, is concurrent training, meaning you're doing hypertrophy work. So that's their repetition efforts. You're doing maximum strength work. So your heavy singles, and you're doing high velocity work, your dynamic effort. So you're doing all of these things at once rather than breaking them up. So conjugate training is not the same thing as conjugate periodization. And so if you look at it, conjugate training is really more of like a daily undulating periodization. And so you're like, oh yeah, so West Side is really just DUP. And they're like, no, it can't be. And I'm like, I mean, a lot of these things are just made up definitions, right? Like nobody's really agreed upon them. But the idea, like, what do you think of conjugate? I'm like, well, you're talking about periodization or training. And so it's, I don't know. That guy, he was wearing a West Side shirt. And so I assumed that he just meant like whatever, that he just was very in that camp, which is fine. Daily undulating periodization, West Side, all that stuff can work. But it's like, let's not misconstrue what I was saying about progression.
I remember what it was.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you guys posted a soundbite, and Alex, if you've pulled it up, interrupt me. But you guys had posted a soundbite about adaptation and how in a population you'll have sort of the bell curve, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think Alex, he had said something about you can't. I don't jump in for me.
I don't want to characterize this post because it's been deleted. I can't see it. But what the conversation I recall having with him afterwards was, so like you had the soundbite about different people responding differently to the same kind of programming.
Yes.
His general response was that like that must be a coaching issue. Like if it was better coached, people would respond the same way to the same stuff. And so what I referred him to was like mostly stuff that like you guys have shared before, but like there's a tremendous amount of literature that for any given person, you're going to have swings in like, if we look just at their 1 rep max on a given day, you can see swings of like up to 20% day to day.
Mm-hmm.
And to like compound that, if we're looking at a large population of people, how do they respond to training? You will see swings of like multiple standard deviations above and below the mean from the same program. And it kind of comes back to like stuff Drew was saying earlier of like, if you, depending on the background you come from, you may have trained a bunch of athletes who, because they succeeded in the system they're in, are probably genetically pretty similar or biomechanically pretty similar. So the same kinds of things are going to work for them and you can get some kind of predictable outcome. But as soon as you move into like a Gen Pop environment, and frankly, tactical looks a lot like Gen Pop, you have to recognize that you have people that are like extremely genetically different from each other. You have people whose lifestyles are extremely different. They're going to be more and less recovered on different days. You have really wide ranging, just like aptitudes for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think it'd be great. And like, I'm reading How Minds Change right now. And like the general takeaway of that book is that facts don't change people's opinion. It actually hardens their opinion. Yes. Like once in a while, I end up having a good conversation with somebody where like you can go back and forth and like provide evidence and people are actually receptive to it. And that's exciting. So I don't know. I'm not mad that he decided to take it down. I just don't want to keep slamming the same conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's just the whole idea is that, you know, you can identify the average response to a given training program, but people are not averages. That, you know, you're going to have a range. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at actual studies where they have individually reported data, you have, evidence where people will lose strength on a strength program, a long one, even going over 6 months, people will lose 10, 11, 12% of strength, and other people will gain, 50%, 60% strength. And you're like, so that's the range. And so if you just reported an average, average improvement was 25% in strength. And you're like, yeah, that's the average response. It's like, yeah, well, people are not the mean, they're not the median average, the median value. This is a really interesting study. They looked at Olympic weightlifters who were competing at the international level, getting ready for the Olympics in Sydney in 2000. And they looked at their performance in at least 3 meets over 18 months leading up to that competition. So you got to expect that these people are the best of the best. They're training their faces off, right? And they're highly motivated to do the best, because the better they qualify, the more likely they are to be in the A final, to be seated well. It's all these other sorts of things, right? They have very wide ranges of performance on their best clean and jerk and snatch in those competitions. And you're like, wait, these are the best of the best. And they're all, at least somewhat genetically similar, right? High prevalence of fast twitch muscle fibers, genetically predisposed to being savages on the platform. And you're looking at, 3 to 5% variance in their clean and jerk and their snatch performance at every meet, up or down. And the ranges get even higher as you include people in the bottom half. So we're just in the top half, it's 5%, but in the bottom half, you're talking 10%, 15%. And that's at the highest level. If you expanded that out to the Gen Pop, what does that performance variation look like? And that's just, again, at a competition. What does that look like in training? All over the place. I just, this idea that you could predict how people are going to do at each training session. I mean, to me, it's not a coaching problem. It doesn't mean that the program is bad. It really just represents a biological problem. Like, people are going to have good days and bad days. And we see that across all other fields. And so why would it not be present in physical performance? It'd be weird if it wasn't here, right?
I think there's a parallel with medical stuff there too, though, right? Because like a medication doesn't have to work for 100% of people to be a useful tool in your toolbox, or a treatment doesn't have to work on 100% of people for it to be relevant. If it works for only 20% of the people, cool. I now just have to figure out who those 20% are, and I have a tool that's relevant for them.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to have like the benefit needs to be present for X amount of the population compared to the side effects they may face, the risks they may face. And then, effectively you're just gauging treatment response. So, oh yeah, well, this medication should have done X, Y, and or Z, but it didn't. Okay. So then we got to move on to the second line medication or a combination of medications or other sort of interventions, not just like, well, there's a problem that we need to fix with the individual. It's like, no, you just change the medication. I mean, like, hey man, you're not trying hard enough with this antihypertensive. You're not trying hard enough. It's like, I don't know, man.
Your fault.
It's just not. Well, I mean, that happens. That happens. You put people on a program, they don't respond well to it. You're not doing the program. It's like,
I think it happens.
What if the program just doesn't work?
Why? So I guess this is like a question just for anyone, but like, why? I don't know. Why is it that is not what is normally taught in strength and conditioning? Like, people are coming into this industry with the idea that like you're dealing with it is not a biopsychosocial model. It is, it is a mechanistic. The Soviets did it this way. We're doing it this way. X equals Y. Like, and then you come across like you guys' work, people like you guys, Mike Teixeira comes to mind, John Kiley, who we had on here, like guys that are having the chat about like, hey, people vary in their responses. And that's like mind blowing for people, or it triggers them and they send Alex messages on Instagram and they're pissed off. I just don't know why that is.
It'd be cool if humans were robots and we just reliably knew what input was going to generate what output. We have some fundamental principles, related to programming variables. So for example, we think that the more specific the exercise is, to the test, the better it's going to transfer to it. We suspect that the more volume of the exercise that you can tolerate and do, that the more robust the response is going to be. So we have a handful of like these fundamental principles, right? But as far as how that interacts with the individual, well, we have to take into consideration their own unique response. And so the way we characterize it is that the nuts and bolts of the training program is the external load. So the exercise selection, the rest periods, the rep schemes, the proximity to failure, all that stuff is the external load. That's the training stimulus. And that gets applied to the individual and filtered through all of the unique factors that make them a unique individual. And you can measure their response using things like RPE, so the rate of perceived exertion, reps in reserve, barbell velocity, heart rate, all of these measurements of what we call internal load. That's the training stress. So you could apply the same program on paper to different individuals, and they're going to get a different experienced response. And you can measure that based on, how hard was this thing? What was the RPE? How many reps in reserve did you have? What amount of barbell velocity decrease did you see? What did your heart rate do? In the middle of the set, in response to the set or the conditioning effort or whatever. And then ultimately, what determines the fitness adaptations generated and the amount of fatigue generated is the internal load. That's measured, that's stress. And so if you ignore that individual response to the training stimulus, then it looks like training stimulus drives fitness adaptations and fatigue, but you're missing that messy middle. And that messy middle is what we're focused on. Like, how do we not only identify how people respond to the training stimulus, but the differences between individuals? Like, how do we modify the training so that we can better tailor it to them? And I mean, that's what we're trying to do here. That's what you guys are trying to do. Ideally, that's what all strength coaches are trying to do. And if you transfer this to medicine, you're like, all right, well, we know if we give you this medication or if we do this intervention or whatever, this should be the expected response. And sometimes it doesn't happen. You're like, all right, well, why? And that's based on the individual. So let's like address the individual factors rather than just tell them, well, you're a piece of junk and, you got to just try harder. You got to want it more. You got to this, that, and the other. And it's like, is that really where we're going with this? I don't know. So yeah, I asked the guy, and I don't want to, keep harping on this. This is probably the last thing I'll say about it. I asked him, like, what do you mean? And he never responded to me, and he deleted the thing. And I was like, all right. I mean, I was up for a conversation. I was just more curious,
Yeah.
But it's like,
and I did have a little back and forth with him. I know him a little bit, so I'll ask. I don't know if he listens to the podcast. I have no idea. But if he does, and if you're listening right now, like, get in the DMs, man. Like, hop in there and have that conversation.
Slide in my DMs, man. I'm just, if you program somebody 5x5 at 70%, and you expect X response, and somebody doesn't get that response, what do you do then? You just say, well, no, keep doing it. And if you're saying, oh, no, you should modify that to suit the individual, I'm like, well, yes, I agree then. So what are we arguing about here? You know what I'm saying? I just can't.
I think that's where a lot of it, I think a huge number of the debates in this field are like largely semantics because some terms are poorly defined and people are like very attached to certain approaches to concepts and things like that. And that's not necessarily bad. Like people get passionate about what they do. And I think semantics are annoying.
Well, I agree with you, but I genuinely do think that for a lot of people in this space, if the program fails, they look at the athlete as the reason why versus having the toolbox to say, hey, maybe we do something different. I just don't see that happening as frequently as you would want it to.
Yeah. I mean, the way I look at it is if the athlete's failing, right, that gives me very few options to like tweak, fix, and otherwise, elicit the response I'm looking for. Then I just like grimace at them or like tell
Turn
them
the
to try
music
harder.
up.
Yeah. I don't know. More ammonia. Like, what's the deal? Or if I view it the other way where it's like, oh, well, the program just wasn't, well suited to what you currently need and are currently going to respond to, then I have almost infinite sort of options. I can adjust the volume. I can adjust the average intensity. I can adjust the proximity to failure, the exercise selection, the rest. I have so many options. And that it's just a bunch of tools that I can use to get what I want, which is you to be stronger, have better cardiorespiratory fitness, whatever. This is probably maybe the last study I bring up, but I like this study. This is great. They took, it was 40 resistance training studies where strength was repeatedly measured throughout the duration of the study. So it wasn't just measured at the beginning and at the end. They measured it also at least one time point in the middle. So 40 resistance training studies. A lot of these were using at least squat and bench press. Some of them were squat, bench press, and deadlift. On average, at what time point do you think the first strength increase was actually identified? So how many weeks into the program do you think, on average, the first strength increase was demonstrated? Are
they trained or untrained individuals?
So about 2/3 of these studies were in untrained individuals and 1/3 were in elite athletes. But on average,
I guess high go 12 weeks.
I'm thinking really early.
I know that's high.
Yeah. The average amount of times that they tested was every 3 weeks. So what was the first, on average, demonstrable increase in strength?
Fourth exposure.
I'm willing to go extremely early if a lot of them were untrained people.
Let's cage. Yeah. Let's go.
All right. so the average time point for the first strength increase to show up was about 4.5 weeks. And that the range that they saw was between 1 and 12 weeks. And it's like huge variance, right? Mm-hmm. And the amount of strength change ranged between 3% improvement to 40% improvement. And you're like, well, yeah, because individuals are going to individual. That's what they do.
Yeah.
That's what humans do.
If somebody's never squatted before and you like show them a few things, you're going to see a dramatic improvement in that session, right? Like but like
likely. Yeah. But some people, you show them some stuff and they, man, this doesn't really fit my levers or my, ability or my style or this, that, and the other. And they might get a little worse. And it's like, well, people, are just wild like that. There are biological, psychological, social, environmental inputs into performance. And so the idea that it's going to happen and this like a metronome, boom, every week. It's like, damn, when else does that happen? Think about an education, right? You're learning cursive, you're learning your times tables, you're learning whatever. It's like, does this reliably happen every day? You get an improvement every week, every month. It's like, no, you're going to have some people pick it up like that. And other people are like, we need a little bit of remediation. And so the teacher, really the education system probably mirrors your guys' system, because it's like, you have to distribute this plan or program to the masses and it for some folks, it's gonna work really well and really quickly, and other folks not so well, not so quickly. And it's like, man, how do you catch all the people in the middle or the people who aren't really responding? You have to have some adjustability baked in, and that may not be part of the thought process right now, which is tough.
Well, some of this comes back to something like a conversation I've been kicking around with other people in kind of the DoD space and like working with the recruiting problems and things like that. And it's something that's kind of at the heart of the barbell medicine thing. But I think there's a real conversation to be had around like, should strength and conditioning professionals see themselves as public health professionals.
Oh,
And
boy.
like that broader responsibility of like, you are not just here to like rigidly apply these frameworks. You are dealing with humans. You are dealing with a lifestyle factor that influences their health, their fitness, their wellness, their mental health, all of it. Like, coming at it from the approach of I am a public health professional kind of changes it to like, you can no longer blame the athlete / now patient if they are non-responding to your initial thing. You have to think through like, what can I provide this person that will work better? I don't know if that's a useful framework or a dangerous idea. I don't know, but the conversation's come up a couple times now.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of coaches and personal trainers being viewed as part of the public health, the communicators, the deliverers of public health information. I mean, you're in the trenches, you're working with people one-on-one. You're like the final you're the final boss. Like, how do you and so at that point, it's like, how do you train people for that profession so that they can do the best job possible? And I think if you, just as you said, if you reworked it from like, I'm a strength conditioning professional, I'm a performance coach, I'm a whatever, to I'm a public health professional and I'm trying to improve the health and performance of these individuals, then you have a sort of greater, not only responsibility, but also a greater sort of range of acceptable outcomes. It's not just like, did their 1RM squat improve? Like, yeah, if you're coaching a bunch of powerlifters, like that's going to be a focus, but there are other ways to make people healthier and improve performance metrics that we know correlate well to health, like strength, like power production, like lean body mass, like cardiorespiratory fitness, without ever touching their 1RM squat. If somebody's able to go from a half body weight leg press to 1.5 times body weight leg press, well, they got stronger. And we know that is correlated with a reduction in premature mortality, for example. So yeah, I think if you kind of rebranded the strength conditioning profession as like a public health, like exercise professional, you probably could see some improvement there, because then people would have, again, a wider array of tools and outcomes that they would be searching for or trying to elicit, rather than just like, did your squat go up? Did your mile time decrease? And I don't want to, if you're a strength conditioning professional and you're listening to this, you're like, well, of course, I'm not just looking at performance metrics. I'm like, great, you're already doing the thing. That's great. Cool. We're not talking at you. You should be just nodding your head. That's great.
Follow, subscribe.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Smash that like button. we're good here, but unfortunately what I see is just as you mentioned earlier, it's like whatever system you were brought up in, whatever type of training that you prefer, people just kind of get stuck inside that rigid box. And it's like, man, there's so many different other things that you could target that would improve somebody's quality of life, their health trajectory, that would compress morbidity, all sorts of stuff. And then even from a performance standpoint, bringing up areas that are undertrained, underdeveloped may have some sort of black box kind of way, it might improve their performance. So for the powerlifter who has, a cardiorespiratory fitness score of 0, and they're like, I don't need to do no stinking cardio, I just need to squat heavy. And it's like, well, you do need to squat heavy. That is true. But your ability to tolerate the training volume necessary to drive the adaptations that you want is going to require some level of cardiorespiratory fitness to not only maintain performance and work capacity throughout a session, but also to recover from that session. So shoring up those sort of gaps that you may have, doing stuff that may not directly apply to your sport, is likely going to be beneficial. And so if you're a public health strength and conditioning coach,
we probably need a better name for it.
Yeah, we could workshop this a little bit, brand it differently. I mean, do you want to just be like a barbell medicine coach? Like, what do we do?
Yeah. Now there's gyms and
you
hospitals.
spun that one pretty well.
There's hospitals and gyms. Yeah.
I mean, I got interviewed for Medscape, which is like this, I don't know how to.
I thought you said Netscape at first, and I was like,
yeah, do you remember Netscape? No, Medscape was like this. It's like a subscription-based physician hub of information. Like, new study comes out, they put it up there. A new like opinion piece comes out, they put it up there. They interviewed me. They were like, "Oh, this gym clinic model. Like, what do you what's that idea about? That was my original idea for barbell medicine. I basically have a clinic up front, gym in the back. The idea would be like, yeah, we're doing all of the primary care stuff. We're screening you, we're testing you, we're treating all the stuff that we need to treat with modern medicine, but then also we're going to put a heavy emphasis on lifestyle and stuff. And so how do we make sure that happens? Well, we're going to send you down the hall to the gym in the back. And ideally, that would be the medical model that we have in this country. That's not what we have right now, outside of like a few boutique like locations, but that would be cool. And then you would have your public health strength and conditioning professional. I mean, I could see the NSCA coming up with another, if they got TSAC, I mean, they might have like, was it?
They love a cert.
Yeah. It could be like public health SAC, whatever. PH something. I don't know, man. The gyms that I go to, there are not a lot of coaches in these gyms. They're mostly just filled with athletes that are just training and whatever. But when I've been to different gyms that have trainers, particularly like commercial gyms, I'm like, what is going on here in this with these trainers? And I'm like, I guess if I'm being charitable, they're helping these folks meet the physical activity guidelines from a resistance training component. And maybe they're giving them homework to meet the physical activity guidelines from an aerobic training standpoint. But like, there's just like, it's a lot of work and a lot of like making people sweaty and not a lot of like what appears to be like well thought out. Here's what we're doing today. Here are the goals for the day's training session. And like, here's how we're going to work this over time. And it's like, man, how did we get here? I don't know. And I don't know that. Does that happen in maybe Instagram? Does that happen in the military? I mean, you guys probably don't see that as much because in order to get access to soldiers or sailors or whatever, you have to be certified and you probably have to submit a plan, right?
Let's be careful. Let's be careful because while we are rolling out programs to bring professionals into the space, the vast majority of the military, the vast majority of the conventional military does not have any kind of professionals involved in their physical training. Oh, and so it is not abnormal. Like when I was a platoon leader, like the standard way things were, right, is that on like each day of the week, a different non-commissioned officer who has no certifications whatsoever is going to be in charge of that day's training.
Why?
And that's just what it is a fantastic question, but like the normal way it is done is like once you pin sergeant, you are instantly bestowed the responsibility of overseeing the physical fitness training of your subordinates. And it rarely is the case that the same sergeant is responsible for like multiple days in a row or multiple weeks in a row of training. It tends to be a constant churn of, and it is not uncommon for that person to find out they're in charge of that day's training
that day,
like 20 minutes before it's go time.
I mean, I guess that would be great if you or I were, happen to be in that group and we got selected, but
I'll hazard a guess here. And Alex, you've been in the military, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception of it as an objective outsider for my whole career is that the military is very much still in World War II, in which people came into the service with a base level of fitness / understanding of health / hey, we're going to run 10 miles up that mountain. Okay, cool. We can all do that. And from what I have seen, the whole people first thing is great, but there hasn't been a ton in terms of like educating your average NCO, your average sergeant to like not only run a session, but like run a single session within the context of like all the sessions. And so Monday might be, Sergeant such and such loves CrossFit, so we're going to do, high intensity interval stuff. Wednesday might be, Captain so-and-so ran cross country in high school, so we're going running. And then Friday, hey, the division commander has designated that every Friday is a long ruck, no matter what happened in all the preceding days. So that's what's going to happen on Friday. And so rinse and repeat throughout the life cycle of your average soldier. And now we see injuries. Now we see burnout. Now we see XYZ. So,
and we do, to lay a little groundwork. Like, I
hope that doesn't get me in trouble.
The average amount of weight gained after somebody separates from the Army is like 30 to 40 pounds over the first year or two after separation. And we're talking like averages there. It is astonishing. Yeah. I think there is a real issue in terms of we teach people, because of going through that system, that exercise is something that wears you down and gradually makes you more disabled, and it is miserable and it has to suck to be effective. And that leaves them going out into the world where they suddenly have like the freedom to make their own lifestyle choices. They're like, man, I'm so glad I'm done with exercise. That sucked.
Yeah. Or they create an Instagram page with like tactical workout videos.
Oh, dude. Yeah. Yeah. When I see,
Throw that out there.
okay, hold on. So this would be like a Kylie type question. All right.
One of our
John Kylie
favorites.
type question. That's right. Yeah. Like we love this guy. Do we agree that having some sort of plan with some constraints would work better than this sort of randomized type approach?
It's
Yes.
100%. And the military generally hinges around planning. Like that is what the military does, is plans and executes complex operations. So you would think they would apply it.
Well, we talked about this with the guys from the study on force blades, where to the military, everyone is a Humvee. Everyone is an aircraft. Everyone's a Humvee, red, yellow, green, check the box. Maintenance is good. Okay, you're deployable. But what we're confronting now is this biopsychosocial, holistic health and fitness, yada, 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 insert whatever buzzword model where you have to account for the individual. And unfortunately, Humvees don't have angry spouses and financial issues, and they don't have a drinking problem. And the military is very good at ordering parts at the right time, but it's not very good at saying, hey, maybe we should take it easy today because, so-and-so had a hell of a night or whatever. I'll get off the soapbox now, but that's where we're at.
That is interesting. It is interesting. Yeah, I would be agreeable that having some sort of plan and constraints like would be beneficial overall, particularly from generating fitness adaptations and reducing risk, injury risk, and this and the other. It just seems so wild to me that you have the resources, but then the strategy would be like, we'll wing it each time. We'll wing it, and not only wing it within like a platoon, but like just across all platoons. We'll have some platoons that are really, really endurance based, whatever, others that are really CrossFit based, and things in between. And it's like, and yeah, that's probably fine. And maybe it is. We don't exactly know, because what you would want to see is like, all right, here's the way we've been doing it, right? Just keep doing that thing. But we're going to have this, like these test cohorts where we do this sort of planned progression. This, over our overarching plan is based on some periodization principles, and it's auto-regulated, individualized on a particular basis. And let's just see how these folks do. And that would be really, really interesting to see. I would suspect, or my expectation would be, that those people would do better. You'd have a reduced injury risk. You'd have better markers of fitness and performance, and that they would eventually, be able to better deal with the, whatever they face during deployment, whatever variations are seen in their day-to-day life. You'd have less burnout, all sorts of like beneficial things. But, and so what we'd want to then reject, the null hypothesis we'd want to reject, is that, there's no difference. And so why do we need to dedicate resources to this additional level of planning and strategizing? And I'm like, so I'd like to see that. And so if you guys can facilitate that, that'd be great. I'll sign on. We can do this thing for free. It's fine. But yeah, I think, that's ultimately where we're coming at this from, right? Is like, why we have a hunch that having a plan in place that is adaptable and individualizable at scale, and you can scale those things. We know how to do it. We think that would be better, but we're not doing it yet. And as far as why we're not doing it yet, that I can't speak to,
and we are starting to do it.
Well, you'd have to take complete ownership of PT away from anybody in uniform, and that is very hard, I think.
Sure.
It's just my assumption, because I'm with you. It's all too easy to like set that up and run it, and the results would speak for themselves.
Yeah. What if we found that there was no difference?
We'd be out of a job.
Well, that'd be an interesting finding. It would be interesting finding. You just have to ask better questions. So why is it not,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Was the program not as individualizable as we'd want it to be? Or did the way we individualize it not really, meet people where they're at? Whatever. We'd find out more stuff. There'd be more questions at the end. But you start to kind of find some answers, some signal that would be, good for improving what we're currently doing. If we're in agreement that what we're doing now isn't the best way, which I think it'd be hard to say that it is. So
this is going to be like a weird journey that will end with me trying to put you on a soapbox where you can rant about something that I know you enjoy. But
all right.
This starts with the like attachment to the way we've always been doing things, and like resistance to change and things like that. And this ties back to something you said really early in the episode about like getting brought out to Fort Irwin because of like their fear of back injuries associated with the deadlift coming out. And some people have pointed out that it's kind of strange that we implemented a new test before we implemented the program that shows people how to train in a more logical way. And I shared that opinion initially until it was like pointed out to me by one of the senior leaders who was involved in making that decision, that the force would have no reason to care about modernizing the way they train until a test showed them that what they've been doing is not working particularly well. And in the early days of the rollout of the ACFT, there was fear that like deadlift is just going to break everyone. It's this terrifying, horrifically risky thing, and everybody's going to get really, really injured. And that fear seems to have mostly dissipated because there was no like massive wave of injuries that we were expecting, and people were happy ignoring the huge burden of overuse injuries that the Army has been tolerating for decades. Like almost all of our injuries are lower body musculoskeletal overuse injuries, many of them attributable to like poor running programming and things like that. I wonder, like, since your like exposure to tactical at first was around like fear of deadlifting, like what was the conversation you had with those folks to like kind of reduce that? Like, I don't know if we want to lump it into kinesiophobia, but just like they had this idea that resistance training is dangerous. Sure. How do we teach a whole culture how to approach it? And the fact that like what they've been doing is kind of dangerous. It's just less like it's less easy. It's harder to picture the danger of like poorly programmed calisthenics and running than it is to picture the danger of hurting your back during a deadlift. I don't know.
Yeah. No, yeah. Well, we brought that up directly, you know, where it's like you can you look at how people are learning, that the social learning component, and people are on social media, you know, they're on Instagram, they're on YouTube, they're on whatever, and they see people, the thumbnail is a person deadlifting with a lumbar flexion and then like a mushroom cloud over their back. And it's like, okay, you may like take that in through your eyeballs, and your visual cortex integrates it into a sort of idea, and then you're like, that doesn't affect me at all. But somewhere deep down, it does affect, you know, how you perceive these things, and you're like, oh, that may be a little bit riskier. And it seems like mechanically, you know, if I just think about it logically, it seems like it'd be inherently risky compared to something like running or push-ups or even sit-ups. I mean, and okay, well, sit-ups we've been doing for a long period of time. There's no additional external load. It's just my body. And so that's all got to be safer. And so the way that we kind of addressed this was that you have these preconceived notions on what is risky and what is not. And then we went through kind of the existing data on injury risk from exercise, and that it is very, very low, not only compared to other non-contact sports. So if you compare it to things like cross-country skiing, for example, or volleyball or whatever, and you look at the injury risk of competitive resistance training outlets, so bodybuilding, powerlifting, you know, CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, etc., the injury risk is somewhere in that 2 to 4 injuries per 1,000 participation hours. And people are like, 2 to 4 per 1,000 participation hours. If I work out, okay, how many hours per week? Oh man, that means like once or twice a year I might have an owie. Isn't that a lot? It's like, well, let's compare that to other activities like cycling or walking. And those are somewhere in the low 1 to 2 range. And it's like, yeah, just from walking, you may have, you know, develop some sort of injury. And in fact, when you compare people who are put on an exercise program where they're doing close to 6 hours of conditioning per week, you compare their injury rates to people who are sedentary, who are not exercising, they have the exact same injury rate. And it's like, look, part of the human condition is being injured. And so if we're looking at just resistance training, is this like a huge, you know, increased risk of musculoskeletal injury? It does not appear to be that right now. So that's just what the data says, but that might not necessarily get you over that fear, that hump. So then we go into like, how can we introduce people to exercise in a safe, well-tolerated, and then also like self-selected manner? And we talk about what type of exercise would we like people to do? Well, we want you to meet the physical activity guidelines. It doesn't mean you have to start there, but we want you to get there based on exercise that you want to do, that you can do, right? And that you have access to. And so effectively, we're building this sort of idea that people can start from literally nothing and generate enough competency and enough resiliency and they possess enough adaptability that they can tolerate just about anything. Certainly a stinking trap bar deadlift. Ultimately the feedback we were getting is that people felt kind of empowered and a little bit fired up. Like I can do this, which is the idea that you'd want people to have. And then the last part that we kind of covered was like, look, even if the worst thing in the world happens, and we ask people, what is the worst thing that could happen? They're like, I herniate a disc. I have a disc herniation. It, shoots across the room while I'm doing my ACFT test, splatters against the wall. I herniate a disc. Even if that were to happen, your sort of trajectory is that it's going to resolve on its own in time. And the worse the herniation is, the more likely it is to resolve on its own without you doing anything. And then you're back to full activity shortly thereafter, just like if you had a running overuse injury, or just like you had something else that happened in the field. And so addressing it from multiple levels based on like, all right, what is the actual risk? So tempering those things, identifying why people have the current beliefs that they do have, and then just sort of expectation management. What's the worst that could happen? And then what do you do? All of those things, I felt like we left Fort Irwin with those folks being empowered and and certainly informed about what this training is going to look like. And the interesting thing is, like you said, there has not been this huge increased signal in low back injuries, even with lack of preparation for this test, which kind of speaks to the resiliency of humans. It's like, isn't it crazy that you can make hundreds of thousands of people do the trap bar deadlift, or tens of thousands of people do the trap bar deadlift without ever having done it before, and you don't see this huge sort of injury spike? You wouldn't expect that. You wouldn't expect that, normally, but yeah, we can. I think what your superiors or former superiors are going to see is that if you allowed people to train in a progressively loaded manner to prepare for these tests, that the existing injury risk that we have now, which is relatively low, would go down even further. People's performances would go up, and you'd see a bunch of positive externalities. Meaning that you'd see less injuries from other things unrelated to the test. You'd see an improvement in health-related, other health condition-related spending. People's blood pressure would go down. Their blood glucose management would go down. Mental health, access to care would be less needed because, again, there's benefit of exercise on all of those things and more. And so, how do you sell somebody on that without like you said, the test being done beforehand? I don't know. You just keep knocking on the door until somebody says, hey, you guys should do this thing so we can see if you're right. And that'd be a great opportunity, but we'll see if that ever comes to fruition,
Well, luckily we've got some senior leaders who are like willing to bet on that. Basically, like the fact that Drew and I have jobs says that there has been an investment in this kind of initiative.
Yeah, I mean, do you think they're going to fund you like to do a study, like a real study, or?
So first off, studies are happening constantly. We're not the guys that run the studies, but like the Army and the DoD employ a huge number of research professionals, including a huge number of physiologists.
I don't know if they know what questions they want to ask, though.
No, but they are like, yeah, there's a whole conversation, and we have had DoD researchers on this podcast before, and we will again in the future, so we can have a conversation about asking the right questions. But there are real efforts going on surrounding that, and there is data being collected to monitor whether the programs being put in place turn out to be effective or not. And
cool.
Yeah, so yes,
yeah, I anxiously await.
So do we.
Yeah.
I think a piece of it though is it sounds really clean to say like, hey, like this battalion here is going to do this model of training and this battalion isn't, and then we're going to compare them. And then you get into like the outrageous number of factors that are going to get in the way of a direct comparison. Like the battalion that was training the way we wanted to, they deployed to Bosnia. And the battalion that like wasn't training the way, well, they live in a climate where they had this and they have access to a gym that this battalion doesn't. And like the amount of turnover in those two units during that period, and how well staffed were the people that were implementing the intervention. And it, like, if there's one thing, I've said this before, like Drew and I talk about like, what is the paradigm of tactical strength and conditioning? If I had to identify one thing that is at the root of what tactical is, it's chaos. And that is both chaos in that it is very hard to predict what their quote unquote sport will look like, because every incident of combat looks different, right? And that's what we're theoretically preparing them for. But also just chaos in the day-to-day execution of it. Like, can you expect the same 12 people to show up every time you want to train that squad? Probably not. One guy's gone doing this, another guy's doing that, whatever. Like there's just, there's so little predictability in both what you're training for and the conditions you're training under that it becomes very difficult.
A whole nother layer requiring some auto regulation. That's what you're saying.
That's exactly.
I agree.
Exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think success will be a marrying of, to your point, more of a better understanding of auto regulation around training, individuality around training from one end, and then from the other end, from like the military end, maybe some of the chaos is self-imposed and self-inflicted, and maybe it does not have to be this way. So I think what right looks like, and this gets back around to the question about research and a study to figure this out. I think it is going to depend on finding that one cohort that's willing to say we want to look at making a change from a couple of different angles, not just, hey, you're doing trap bar deadlifts now instead of ruck marches. Are you a better soldier? I don't know. But like that's a level of complexity that I think freaks a lot of people out.
That's why we have statisticians.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Data scientists and stuff like that. Yeah.
I work with people whose job is to figure that out. Good luck to them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Much smarter people than me. That's for sure.
Well, we've kept you forever, so we'll get out of your hair. But thank you so much for coming on and having this chat. I think it's definitely going to be well received.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think people, we may have been all over the place, but I think we covered some good ground.
That was the intent.
Yeah. No, I'm here for it.